everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right in and study some Jewish history together. So tonight, as promised, we are going to talk about the two pillars of the Jewish people, the two pillars of what we call the Rishonim, the medieval rabbis, and really two pillars who did so much to make Torah learning completely accessible to not only those in their generation, but their contributions have done such for Jews from their generation until this very day. And tonight's discussion will, of course, revolve around Rashi and the Rambam. Rashi is the pillar of the Ashkenazi Jewish world, and the Rambam is the same in the Sephardic Jewish world. And we are going to discuss their lives and what they contributed to the Jewish world and how it came about, etc., etc. So let's just dive right in. First, let's talk about Rashi. Rashi was born in the city of Troyes in France in the year 1040. So at the time that Rashi was born, things were relatively calm in France. There had been tremendous upheaval. There was going to be tremendous upheaval. But Rashi was born in a fairly quiet time. And the Jews of France actually thought they had a certain amount of protection in those few short generations from the French government. And they, when you have that kind of protection, you'd think it's going to last forever. But we're going to see by the end of Rashi's life, things become tremendously tumultuous. So Rashi's real name is actually Rav Shlomo Yitzchaki, or Rav Shlomo ben Yitzchak. Yitzchaki is just a way of saying son of Yitzchak. So he was known as Rav Shlomo Yitzchaki. And Rashi truly represents the family of Ashkenazi Jewry. It's often referred to as the house of Rashi. And that's not to say that every Ashkenazi Jew today descends from Rashi, but it is to say that philosophically we are all built on Rashi, because what he contributed to the Jewish world made the Ashkenazi Jewish world, and really the entire Jewish world, because his influence spread far beyond just the Ashkenazi Jewish world. Now, Rashi's father was presumed to be a vintner, and as was Rashi, most assumed that Rashi was a vintner. It's interesting because Rashi in all of his writings never refers to being a vintner, but it seems like it's the working assumption that he was. There is only one person, Chaim Soloveitchik, not Reb Chaim, but the later Chaim Soloveitchik, who questions this, because apparently the grounds, the soil of Troyes is not the right type of soil for growing wine, and it was not a wine-growing country. But be it as it may, the working hypothesis is that Rashi was a vintner, his father was a vintner, and that's how Rashi made his sustenance, through growing grapes, making wine, and that's how it was done. So beyond this, really, first and foremost, Rashi was a scholar, and at a very young age, he already outgrew the scholarship that was available to him in Troyes, and he went on to study in the great Ashkenazi yeshivas, first of Worms and then of Mainz. Both of these yeshivas were founded by the students of Rabbeinu Gershon. So even though Rabbeinu Gershon, who's considered the founder of Ashkenazi Jewry, even though he was not around at this point, he had already gone to the next world, his students were still around. And Rashi was, we'll call him a second-generation student of Rabbeinu Gershon. But Rashi becomes the one who truly encompasses everything that was Rabbeinu Gershon, making him the true leader of the Jewish people, of the Ashkenazi Jewish people. Now, Rashi, when he is in Mainz, that is where he marries, and he has his two children. There are some sources that say Rashi had 3 children, but for the most part, what seems to be widely accepted is that he only had 2 children, 2 girls by the name of Yocheved and Miriam. And when Rashi as a student in yeshiva, he is already known for what he becomes famous for throughout the Jewish world. And that is that Rashi, while definitely his most famous name is Rashi, he is often referred to as well as Kuntras. And he's usually referred to as Kuntras by the Balei Tosfos, we'll discuss who they are shortly, or other of the Rishonim, of the medieval commentators. But the way that he got that name Kuntras, it was actually his nickname in yeshiva. Kuntras in Hebrew means notebook. And Rashi, already from the time that he was in yeshiva, was known for being a tremendous note taker and known for organizing his notes in a very easy to use, concise way. So Rashi already from young age was known for this, and this actually becomes these notebooks, these kuntras become the foundation of the monumental commentaries that he will eventually write. So the nickname kuntras sticks, and we'll see that he is often referred to as kuntras. So at a certain point, after Rashi is married, after his two daughters are born, he returns to the city of Troyes, to his hometown, to take on the position of the rabbi of the town. Now, Troyes was definitely not a major community like Worms and Mainz and even Spires, which were the main Jewish communities. Troyes was a city that's about 80 miles or so southeast of France. It's a couple hundred miles west of the Rhineland communities, which were the main Jewish communities in those days. And Rashi, had he stayed in the yeshivas, probably could have become a Rosh Yeshiva, become a big influence in those towns. But for whatever reason, he decided he wanted to go back to his hometown and accept the position as the rabbi of his town. Now, it seems that one of the reasons he did this is because he figured, being a rabbi in a smaller town like Troyes, he would have more time to dedicate to his writings and the goal of publishing his monumental commentaries that he eventually does produce. And that could be the main reason that he left Mainz to go back to his hometown. Now, it's interesting. When he leaves Mainz, the yeshiva gifts him a copy of the Talmud that had been preserved since Babylon. So a very authentic, a very sacred and valuable edition of the Talmud was given as a gift from the yeshiva to Rashi when he goes back to Troyes. Now, as he gets to Troyes, he accepts the position as the rabbi. He becomes a dayan, a Jewish judge in the Jewish court of Troyes. And it's interesting because Rashi often claimed that he didn't have any real rabbinic training before he got back to his rabbinic position, but his tremendous scholarship and his tremendous insight shows through in all of his decisions, all of the response that we have from him, and he becomes a beloved rabbi in the town of his birth. Now, Rashi eventually starts to release his writings to the population of Troyes, to his congregants, to his parishioners, if you will. And his original published writings were the commentaries on the Talmud. So he starts to give the commentaries he writes in the Talmud to his students in Troyes, and slowly but surely they gain popularity. They spread through outside of Troyes. And in this process, Rashi not only is the rabbi and the head of the Jewish court, but he builds a yeshiva. As his approach becomes more and more famous, more and more widespread, Jews come from all over the Ashkenazi areas of France, Germany, to come to Troyes to study under Rashi. Now, Rashi, when he started publishing his writings, he would sign them quite simply Shin Yud. Now, Shin Yud would read She, and the reason he would sign Shin Yud is because those are basically his initials, Shlomo Yitzchaki, right? Shlomo, the son of Yitzchak. But as he continued to publish these writings, his congregants, his students, would add a resh to the beginning of this for rabbi. So as if to say Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki or Rashi. And that is where the name Rashi comes from. Rashi is an acronym for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, but not where Rashi named himself. Rashi originally was just citing his writings as She, and his disciples came to add on the resh to make it Rashi. And that's how we got the world-famous name for Reb Shlomo Yitzchaki. Now, in later generations, we look back at that same name, which again is the acronym Resh Shen Yud, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, and it was also said that he is Rabban Shel Yisrael, same letters, the rabbi of the Jewish people. So Rashi, in his time, quite simply meant just Shlomo Yitzchaki, but in later generations and until, really throughout antiquity and until the modern days, in many ways it also means the Rabban Shel Yisrael, the rabbi of the Jewish people, because that's truly who Rashi becomes as he starts to publish this commentary on the Talmud. Now, this is really the first major comprehensive commentary on the Talmud that has ever been published. In his lifetime, he's able to write on 30 out of the 36 tractates of the Talmud, and it is a masterpiece unmatched by any other. Rashi's goal in writing his commentary on the Talmud was to be able to make the Talmud more accessible for not only scholars, but even for laymen. And as we mentioned before, the Talmud in and of itself is not punctuated. It's often difficult to know if you're dealing with the question and answer, where you are in the discussion. And that is what Rashi comes to do throughout the thousands of pages of the Talmud that he writes his commentary on. His goal is always to be able to get you to the next line. And whether that's putting in punctuation, whether that's translating words, whether that's making grammatic corrections, whether that's just explaining the topics, Rashi's goal is always just to get you to the next line. It's to hold your hand throughout the pages of the Talmud to be able to get you from one line to the other. And that is what the commentary has done successfully since its publication in the 12th century until this very day. Now, one of the truly amazing things about Rashi's writing is not only that he was able to add such clarity to every single page of the Talmud, but he does it in the most clear, clean, concise way possible with the shortest amount of words and in a way that, like we said, anybody could really understand it. And so he took the Talmud, which until this point, from its publication until this point, for the 600 years or so, it had been 700 years or so, it had been around, almost 800 years, it had been really only accessible to scholars. But now, by giving a commentary that made it more user-friendly, if you will, the Talmud became accessible to essentially everybody, making the Talmud a book for the entire Jewish people. So, if I was to ask a question, who is really the one who made the Talmud a book for all the Jewish people? The answer would be Rashi. And he's the first one who wrote this comprehensive running commentary. There were some other commentaries that preceded him. Rabbeinu Hananel, we mentioned before, Rabbeinu Rav Yitzchak Fasi, who wrote a halachic synopsis, but Rashi is the first one who writes a commentary like this, really just explaining the words of the Talmud, trying to clarify the words of the Talmud, and in just such a comprehensive, concise way. And because of that, within a few hundred years, with the printing press and the eventual printing of the Talmud through the printing press, the Cincino Talmud and later the Vilna Talmud that we use today, the commentary of Rashi appears on the inside margin of every single page of the Talmud that Rashi wrote on, making it the main commentary of the Talmud, giving it that pristine place right next to the words of the Talmud. Now, it's interesting that Rashi and the Talmud, and even the other text of Rashi is always given to us in something called Rashi script, which is just a different font than the rest of the Talmud or whatever book Rashi's commenting on. It's a different font than the rest of the text. Now, Rashi did not write in Rashi's script. It was not created by Rashi. Rashi never saw Rashi's script. In fact, if Techias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, would happen today and Rashi would be here with us and we would show him Rashi's script, it's quite possible he would have a difficult time reading it. It had nothing to do with Rashi. It was later by the publishers just to make the distinction between the text of the Talmud and the text of Rashi. But be it as it may, that is what the commentary that Rashi gives us on the Talmud gives to us and makes the Talmud truly accessible to every single Jew. Now, Rashi's two daughters married two of his main students from the yeshiva. Yocheved, the older daughter, married Meir ben Shmuel, known to us as the Ram, and Miriam, the younger daughter, married Yehuda ben Nassan, known to us as the Rivan. And they had children who became tremendous scholars. In fact, Yocheved's two children are two of the most famous of the disciples of Rashi, of the scholars that come in the next generation. One is known to us as Rishmuel ben Meir, or the Rashbam, and the other one is known to us as Rabbeinu Yaakov, Tam, or Rabbeinu Tam, who are two of the main of the Balei Tosos. Now, who are the Balei Tosos? The Balei Tosos is the name that we use for the son-in-laws, the grandchildren, and the main disciples of Rashi, and the commentaries that they write. Now, the style of their commentaries always built on Rashi. In fact, more often than not, what they do is they are comparing and contrasting seemingly contradicting ideas, thoughts, writings, mentionings that Rashi himself wrote, either from within one tractate, just from one page to another, or from other tractates. And that quite often is what they aim to do in the yeshivas that Rashi established, and the descendants of those yeshivas, and in the writings, that's what they did. Now, these writings become known to us as Tosfos. Tosfos means additions. The idea being that they're the additions to Rashi, because they're asking the questions on the macro corpus of what Rashi wrote, and therefore refer to those as the addition. Now, the additions, the Tosfos, also got a very prominent place in the eventual publication through the printing press of the Talmud, and that is there on the outside margin of every page of the Talmud. Now, the Tosfos commentary is not unlike Rashi, which the Rashi commentary is written specifically by Rashi and organized by Rashi. That's not how the Tosfos commentary came about. The Tosfos commentary is a compilation of the different writings of these rabbis, the disciples of Rashi, where they question Rashi's statements here unto there, and they are organized and put onto the page of the Talmud in an organized way. This is no way the entire corpus of what the Balei Tosfos wrote. These are the ones that on one level were the ones the publishers chose, but really on another level the ones that survived. Because we know that a lot of the writings of the Balei Tosfos were lost in a tragedy we're going to talk about in subsequent weeks. In 1240, when King Louis IX of France burnt 24 cartloads of the Talmud and other Jewish texts, included in that burning were many of the writings of the Balei Tosfos. So those writings were lost forever in that great fire, and what we have today is a compilation of whatever was left. Now, these rabbis, because their commentary is known as the commentary of Tosfos, they become known as the Balei Tosfos, the ones who of Tosfos. Probably in their time, in their own generation, they didn't call themselves that, but that's who they are. So again, this group of people is the commentary on the outside of the Talmud. The commentary comes to ask questions on Rashi's commentary and answer questions on Rashi's commentary, and it was the son-in-laws, the grandchildren, and the close disciples of Rashi, for the most part, all in France, but there were some of the Balei Tosfos who did end up settling in Germany and even in England, but still they corresponded with the house of Rashi, and therefore we will even find their writings sometimes amongst the writings in the commentary of Tosfos. And that's an idea of the eternal, and how the eternal flame of Rashi went on to the next generation. Now it's interesting. Rashi, in so many ways, was wise and advanced beyond his years. So Rashi, in his lifetime, educated his two daughters to be able to read, write, to study Torah, to understand concepts of Torah. In fact, Rashi's daughters were his scribes. They were often the ones who took down his letters and responsa for the questions that he got. They were the ones who would transcribe them down. They would transcribe his writings down. And they were an integral part of the house of Rashi and the development of the Torah that Rashi produced. So it's fascinating that in this time period, 11th century, 12th century, the non-Jewish world was not educated at all, men or women, no one. And here you have Rashi, who's opening this major academy, and not only that, but educating women in a way that women wouldn't be educated for many, many, many generations to come. So just a fascinating thing about Rashi. Now, I do want to dispel a very famous myth, and that is that Rashi's daughters wore tefillin. Now, is it possible that Rashi's daughters wore tefillin? Sure, it's possible. I don't want to get into the halachic discussion or the philosophical discussion. Right, wrong, today, is it right or wrong? Should it be done, not should be done? I want to ignore that discussion for today. But suffice it to say, it's not a proper thing, at least in our times. 1,000 years ago, it could have been that it was more acceptable. But one thing is for certain, there is no evidence whatsoever that Rashi's daughters wore tefillin. Rashi doesn't mention it. There's no history of the time that mentions it. It is a latter assumption because they were such wise women and worked so closely with Rashi that they themselves did wear tefillin, but there is no substantial proof whatsoever that they actually did wear tefillin. So just let's dispel that myth. Now, Rashi lived for several decades of his life under relative peace. There was relative good relations between the Catholics and the Jews, but as his life inched closer and closer and closer to the Crusades at the end of his life and at the end of the 11th century, obviously the relationship became more and more tumultuous. Rashi, in fact, had relationships with many of the local priests and cardinals and bishops and whatnot, and he was often challenged to a disputation, to an open debate on Judaism versus Catholicism versus Christianity, and Rashi always avoided doing those. Did whatever was necessary to avoid doing it, stayed as far away as he could. In fact, there's one record that there was one certain cardinal that he had a relationship with who kept challenging him to a disputation, and the disputation was to be on the book of Isaiah. And Rashi's response was to send him a special copy of his commentary on the book of Isaiah. Now, after that, a lot of Rashi's commentaries circulate throughout the Catholic Church. And there's always attempts to challenge Rashi in debate. There's always attempts to try and have that conversation. Rashi saw that no good could come from it. He saw, first of all, he's obviously not going to convince anyone. And second of all, it could only lead to strife between the Jews and their Christian neighbors. Now, Rashi, this just shows the general tone of Rashi, that Rashi is completely apolitical. He avoided anything that could be involved with politics, with intercommunal politics, as literally like a plague. And but on the flip side, he did know which way the winds were blowing, and he was definitely concerned about the impeding crusades and the deteriorating relationship between the Jews and the Catholics. And we see that he was very upset about that. And of course, once it broke and we saw the Crusades come about and we see the communities of Worms and Mainz, where he spent his formative years, decimated. We see tens of thousands of Jews murdered there, and that has a tremendous effect on Rashi towards the end of his life. And the Jews of Troyes were petrified that what was happening in the German Rhineland, in the French Rhineland, German-French Rhineland, a few hundred miles away from Troyes, could very easily overflow to Troyes. So while they definitely lived in terror during this time period in Troyes, the Crusades, or at least the treachery and the murder and the torture of the Crusades never came to Troyes. Now, there is a legend that Godfrey de Bellaion, who was the leader of the First Crusade, who conquered Jerusalem, the first king of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, that he demanded an audience with Rashi, and Rashi, of course, demurred like he always did. And so Godfrey de Bellaion, before leaving for Israel, came to Troyes to see Rashi, and he asked Rashi, what do you think about us going to Israel to conquer the land from the infidels, from the Muslim infidels that are there? And as legend goes, Rashi responded, you're going to go there, you're going to be successful, but you're not going to hold on to the city of Jerusalem for very long, and you're going to come back here to Troyes with only 2 horses. And legend has it that sure enough, the Crusaders were successful. They conquered Jerusalem, but they didn't manage to hold it for very long. And Godfrey de Bellaion comes back to Troyes with 3 horses, because he had made it clear to Rashi before he left that if the prophecy didn't come true exactly as he said, Rashi would pay and all the Jews of Troyes would pay. So as Godfrey de Bellaion is entering the city of Troyes, a boulder falls off of the gates and kills one of his horses, leaving him with only 2 horses. That's a legend. Christian sources say that he was the king of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, only ruled for about a year before he died, and that he is buried in the land of Israel. Okay, but be it as it may, this shows you a little bit of the deteriorating relationships between the Jews and the Christians at the time, and gives you the feeling of what Rashi had to endure towards the end of his life. Now, towards the end of Rashi's life, he completes what is really in many ways his magnum opus, and that is his commentary on the Chumash. Because the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, was completely inaccessible without commentary. It's incomprehensible. You can't know what to do. You can't even know how to read it, can't know how to pronounce it, can't know how to translate it without some sort of commentary. Now, in many ways, the commentary comes to us from the Midrashim, from the Talmud, and that's what Rashi is for sure based on, but Rashi, again, in his clear, concise way, writes an easy type understand commentary, running line for line throughout the Talmud. Every single question that pops up, every single incomprehensible part of the Talmud, Rashi's there to punctuate, translate, explain, and that is what he does. And in so doing, he truly gave the Chumash to every single Jewish person, because every Jewish person who has a little bit of Jewish scholarship usually prides himself on knowing the words of Chumash and Rashi, and it made the Chumash an acceptable work. So his life's work of the Talmud, of his commentary on the Talmud, makes the Talmud much more accessible to everybody, and his commentary on the Chumash, his clear, concise commentary on the Chumash, makes the 5 books of Moses acceptable and accessible to everybody. Now, with this tumultuous end to Rashi's life, we know that Rashi wrote several slichos, prayers of forgiveness, many of which we have today, and several of which are actually in our liturgy of what we say before Rosh Hashanah, of what we say on some of the fast days. And when Rashi dies, we do not know his place of burial. But an interesting thing happened in more modern times, that there was a professor from the Sorbonne, who came across an old map of the city of Troyes that marked the old Jewish cemetery, and the assumption is that that is where Rashi was in fact buried. Now, that area today is an open square in the city of Troyes, so the community built a memorial there marking that this was probably the place where Rashi was buried. So if you go to Troyes today, you can see this beautiful, you can Google it and see it, this beautiful monument that's built to commemorate Rashi, quite possibly on top of the place where the Jewish cemetery was, and therefore that would be the burial place of Rashi. Now, I want to mention one other very noteworthy work that came out from Rashi. It's a book called the Machzor Vitri. The Machzor Vitri was written down by one of Rashi's disciples, Rav Simcha Vitri, and in it records all the laws of the holidays according to Rashi. Simcha Vitri would record how Rashi, the halachic positions and the position on the customs for all the holidays, and is recorded in this book Machzor Vitri, which is a backbone of Jewish law unto this very day, when we really want to know what to do, especially when it comes to the holidays. And that essentially is the life of Rashi. Now, as we jump into the Rambam, we know a lot more about the life of Rambam than we know about Rashi. Now, one reason for this is because while they were both tremendously prolific writers, the Rambam seemed to be, at least in volume, more prolific, and not only that, but seemingly almost everything from the Rambam is preserved, and something that was known as the Cairo Gennizza. The Cairo Gennizza was discovered a shul in Cairo where they had a Gennizza. A Gennizza is a place where you take old Jewish books, old Torah scrolls you're not using anymore, to be able to hide them away. And because Cairo has an arid climate, the scrolls that were put into the Cairo Gennizza did not become moldy, did not disintegrate. They were put there for whatever reason, but they stayed basically intact, which would not be the case in many other parts of the world, especially in Europe, especially in France, especially in Troyes. So if Rashi indeed wrote as much as the Rambam, and it ended up in some Gennizza, it would turn into mold and eaten by moths, and we wouldn't have it anymore. But because where the Rambam's works and writings ended up was in the Cairo Gennizza and the arid climate of Egypt, it stayed preserved, and therefore we know vastly more about the Rambam's life than we do about Rashi's life. Okay, on to the Rambam. The Rambam's full name was Rav Moshe ben Maimon, Rav Moshe, the son of Maimon. Now, there's, similar to Rashi, we have to kind of explain the different names of where they come from. So the famous name of the Rambam, that's quite simple where that comes from, because we just take the letters and we can extrapolate them of Reb Moshe ben Maimon, Moshe the son of Maimon, and that's where the name Rambam comes from. Now, Rambam is also known quite often as Maimonides, coming from Greek, Latin. Anytime you have the adis added to the end of a name, that means son of. So the Rambam's father was Maimon, and therefore Maimonides means son of Maimon. Now, on the tomb of the Rambam, which unlike Rashi's tomb, which is somewhat unknown, maybe marked, maybe not, we know exactly where the Rambam is buried. He is buried in the city of Tveria, the city of Tiberias in Israel, and you can visit his grave today. And written on the tombstone, written on the epitaph, it says, "Memoshe ad Moshe lo kam kemoshe," meaning that from Moshe Rabbeinu, from Moses who gave us the Torah, until Moshe, the Rambam, no one arose in the Jewish people like Moshe. Because in many ways, that's who he was. He was the greatness of Moshe, and nothing had been realized from Moshe until the Rambam, as great as Rashi, as the Rambam, and no one since has been recognized as such greatness. Now, the Rambam comes onto the scene really in the zenith of the Golden Age of Spain. But we're going to see shortly into his life, the Golden Age of Spain starts to become a little bit more tumultuous, and it becomes to be the slow downward spiral to the end of the Golden Age of Spain. Now, Rambam was born in Cordoba in the year 1135, and at that time, Cordoba was a true Jewish metropolis. The Jewish community was thriving at the time. His father, Maimon, was a Dayan, was a Jewish judge in the time, and his father was one of his main teachers. Now, the other one of his main teachers was a rabbi known as the Ri, or Rabbeinu Yosef, from Gash, Rimi Gash. And the Rima Gash was a disciple of Rabbeinu Alfasi, Rav Yitzchak Alfasi, that we mentioned before. Now, he was one of the youngest disciples of Rav Yitzchak Alfasi, and Rav Yitzchak Alfasi lived a very long life, and the Rambam was a disciple of the Rima Gash later in his life. So while there's, 100, 150 years separating the Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi and the Rambam, he's only one generation removed in education. And what's interesting is one of the greatest contributions that the Rambam will give to the Jewish world is that he will be the one to truly codify Jewish law, but it'll be based heavily on the work of the Rif, who is the one who summarized the words of the Talmud to incorporate only the halachic position. Now, by the time the Rambam was 13, he claimed to already have a complete education. As if to say he knew a lot of his stuff by the time he was 13. And in many ways, the Rambam was a Renaissance man. He was all self-taught. He was again, he had his teachers, but so much of who he became himself. Now, until the age of 13, the Moors were in control of Spain. And as we said before, the Jews always did very well under the Moors. But in the year 1148, the Almohads staged a revolution and started to take over parts of Spain. Now, the Almohads' name, which means in Arabic, for Muhammad, they are a much more fundamentalist group, and the Jews do not do so well under Almohad rule. In fact, in Cordoba, the Almohads make a decree that we've heard many times before, and we'll hear many times after this point in history. And that is, the Jews have a choice of either converting to Islam, leaving Cordoba, or being killed. And the Jews were given a couple of days to think about it. Many of the Jews stayed and outwardly converted to Islam. Many of the Jews fled, and the family of the Maimon family was one of those families that fled. The Rambam and his family fled and basically become nomads for the better part of a decade. Now, it's interesting because in Muslim records it says that the family of Maimon actually converted to Islam. But that was a very, very common fabrication amongst the Muslims, is that they would write down that the scholars and the rabbis and the rabbinic leadership of the Jewish community in fact converted to Islam when they in fact did not do so, and they had fled the area. And that is what the family of Maimon, that's what Rambam's family did. And he fled and wandered throughout all of Spain, but anywhere where they went in Spain, the revolution of the Almohads seemed to follow them. So eventually, after wandering for the better part of a decade, they come to Fez in Morocco. And we know at that point that Maimon, the Rambam's father, is still alive. And we have the Rambam, we have his brother David, and David has a daughter. And that's the nuclear family, if you will, at this point of Maimonides and the Rambam. Now, it's interesting that even though the Rambam lived through these tumultuous times at the hands of the Muslims, that when it came to these Jews who outwardly converted to Judaism, to Islam, but inwardly stay Jewish, the Rambam always felt that those people should be welcomed back into the Jewish community when they had the opportunity to do so, when they had the opportunity to come back. And he wrote in fact, his father wrote a pamphlet by the name of Igeres HaNechama to help to encourage these Jews. The Rambam wrote something called Igeres HaShmad, which did the same thing. And by the way, Rashi, who we were just discussing before, did the same thing in Troyes, in France, that he insisted that any Jew that was forcibly converted by a crusader, but really wanted to remain a sincere Jew, and they had the opportunity to act sincerely as a Jew, that they should be welcomed back into the Jewish community. Now you can imagine how hard that would be. I mean, think about the Rambam, for instance, whose family had to wander as nomads because of the pressure of the Almohads. Like, how would we have questioned it if the Rambam had taken a more stern approach to the Jews who decided to, I don't want to call it taking the easy way out, but who decided to outwardly convert? Would we have been surprised if he took a stronger approach with them? No. I mean, look at. It's like saying, like my family's nomadic for a decade, and you go and live the high life, and then you want to come back in and get Maftir Yonah and Shul on Yom Kippur? Forget it. But no, we see the Rambam and his father Maimon and Rashi did the same thing. They encourage the Jewish community not to hold that grudge, and because look, we can never judge a person when they're in these situations, and the communities were encouraged to bring those people back into the community when the opportunity afforded itself. Now the Rambam was not in Fez for very long. He's only there for about 5 years, and then the Almohads came to Fez, came to Morocco. So at this point, we know that the Rambam goes to the land of Israel. Now, what's unclear is if the Rambam intended to emigrate to the land of Israel or if he was just visiting the land of Israel. We don't know the answer to that. What we do know is in this time period, 1165 to 1170, this is just before the outbreak of the Third Crusades. And the land of Israel has been completely decimated, ravaged, destroyed by the first two crusades, and the impeding third crusade would do the same, and it just wasn't such a safe place. I mean, you had the marauding knights that we had talked about before all over the country. You had the kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders still technically controlled the country, and it was not a very it couldn't have been a very hospitable country. So that would sound almost like the theory that the Rambam did want to go there to settle, but it was so inhospitable because of the Crusaders that he had to leave. Or we say that Rambam knew about the Crusaders and being inhospitable, but he wanted to visit the land of Israel, so he took the risk and went there for a 5-month trip. Now Rambam writes, in these 5 months, he travels the whole country, he visits Jerusalem, he prays on the Temple Mount, he goes to the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron, which again, all of these are we can only imagine what he had to go through in any of these situations, because the whole country is basically controlled by the Crusaders at this point. And he's able to, the Temple Mount has a church on it basically at this point. But we see that somehow the Rambam is able to do it and have this amazing odyssey, 5-month odyssey in the land of Israel, after which he finally comes to Egypt, which is where he will live the rest of his life. Now, the Rambam, when he comes to Egypt, initially comes to Alexandria, which was the real famous Jewish community of Egypt. But then he goes on to Fostat, which is the old city of Cairo. Unclear why he left the big city of Alexandria for the small city of Fostat. One theory is that the city of Fostat was under the control of the Karaites, and the Rambam felt that he could hold sway over them if he moved to their town. And we'll see that that's what he does. That the Rambam, unlike we mentioned Rashi Agon before, who really fought the Karaites head on, Rambam had a completely different approach with the Karaites. He always figured you can win more, at least in this case, you can win more with honey than with bees, or however the saying goes. And he really reached out to the Karaites, encouraged them to come into the Jewish community, to give up their Karaite nonsense, and really through just that love, he was able to win over the Karaite community of Cairo. Now, it's around this time that his father Maimon dies. And as the Rambam finally, it seems that he has, after all this nomadic time of, roughly whatever it is, 20 years, run away from the Almohads, and Egypt is not in control of the Almohads, and it seems like the Rambam is going to finally have some solace from everything he had to go through. We see that he we see that he really holds the Muslims accountable. And if, as we mentioned before, the Rashi always stayed very far away from politics. Rambam often jumped right in it, and we see in a lot of his writings, he, let's just say he let us know how he felt, especially about the Muslims. He would refer to Muhammad as Isha Meshuga, about the crazy man, or Osho Yishmaeli, that Ishmaelite, and did not have a lot of nice things to say about the Muslims. If you want to see more about this, you can check out the Rambam's famous Igeres Teman, the letter he wrote to the Jews of Yemen, and that's Rambam's, purview when he finally settles in Egypt. Now, you can ask a question on the Rambam settling in Egypt, and that is that if we look in the Torah, it is prohibited after the Jews left Egypt for a Jew to return to Egypt and to settle there. And the Rambam was completely aware of this. In fact, he would sign his letters during the time that he lived in Egypt as Anochi Moshe ben Maimon, I am Moses the son of Maimon, HaSfardi, the Sephardic Jew, Ha'over b'chol yom shlosh lavim, who violates every single day 3 prohibitions of the Torah. So he was aware of the prohibitions. He agreed there were prohibitions. So if that was the case, why did the Rambam settle in Egypt? The answer is that, if we look at any of the goings and comings of the Jews in exile, one of the big questions, and this is often asked of Eastern European Jewry, of German Jewry, Polish Jewry, etc., like, why didn't they leave? Like, Hitler came to power in 1933, Kristallnacht wasn't until 1938, and you had the Nuremberg laws in between, and the war didn't break out until 1939, and the final solution wasn't until 1941. So why did the Jews get out between 1933 and 1941? The answer is, number one, the Germans didn't make it easy at all. You had to give up everything, and it was not easy in any way, shape, or form. But beyond that, like, where are you going to go? America did not have its doors open for immigration. America had tremendous quotas limiting immigration. And not only that, even if you could reach the quota, you had to have someone in America sign an affidavit of financial responsibility to take you in. So, you couldn't get into America, you couldn't get into England, you couldn't get into Israel, because the British didn't let you go into Israel. So part of the question is, where are you going to go? And that's the same thing with the Rambam. He had already been throughout Spain, he'd been to Morocco, he'd been to Israel. Where are you going to go? So he settles in Egypt. And again, he felt he could do some good there because there was still a sizable community of Jews in Egypt. Again, all violating those 3 prohibitions in the Torah, but with nowhere else to go seemingly in the world, so they all settled there. Now, the Rambam, during the first 8 years he is in Egypt, he is a full-time scholar. He has the support of his brother David, who runs the family business. The family business is dealing in precious stones, and the Rambam was part of that business from an investment standpoint, but his brother David ran the business entirely, allowing the Rambam to study, to learn, to write, and it is during this time period that the Rambam writes the first of his 3 major works. The first of the Rambam's 3 major works was entitled Sefer HaMaor. We now refer to it as the Pirush HaMishnayos, which means quite simply commentary on the Mishnah, because it is a beautiful commentary written on the Mishnah. Now the Rambam, with his works, he would vary between writing in Arabic, which was the lingua franca in Egypt and in the Sephardic world, and writing in Hebrew. Now, the Pirush HaMishnayos, the goal of this commentary on the Mishnah the Rambam wrote was to make the Mishnah accessible for the layman. So therefore, he writes in Arabic. So if you want, think about it as the original art scroll, because that's what the Rambam essentially was doing when he wrote his works in Arabic, so they should be accessible to every single Jew. And we're going to see with his different writings that some are going to be in Hebrew, some are going to be in Arabic, with the goal being that if it's for a scholar, it'll be in Hebrew. But if it was written for the layman, he always wrote it in Arabic. Now that was very revolutionary in its time because, few scholars were doing that, but that's what the Rambam did. Now, somewhere around 1170, a tremendous tragedy happens for the family of the Rambam, and that is that his brother, in a cross-continental mission business trip in the Indian Ocean, his ship is lost at sea, and his brother is lost at sea along with that ship. And this tremendously rattles the Rambam. In fact, in one of those letters that we have from the Cairo Gennizza, it reads, in the words of the Rambam, that the greatest It reads that the greatest misfortune that has befallen me during my entire life, worse than anything else, was the demise of the saint, may his memory be a blessing, who drowned in the Indian Sea, carrying much money belonging to me, to him, and to others, and left me with a little daughter and a widow. On the day I received the terrible news, I fell ill and remained in bed for about a year, suffering from a sore boil, fever, and depression, and was almost given up. About 8 years have passed, but I am still mourning and unable to accept consolation. And how should I console myself? He grew up on my knee. He was my brother and my student. So this beautiful letter shows the benevolence between the Rambam and his brother, the love that he had for his brother, and how when his brother is lost at sea, how it literally rattles him into a state of depression for a year. And next week when we'll continue the story of the Rambam and then delve into some other personalities from this time, but we'll delve into what happens afterwards when the Rambam has to now, he was supported financially by his brother, he was working on his writings. Now he's left destitute because not only was his brother's wealth lost at sea, his own wealth was lost at sea, and he has to take care of not only his own family, but his brother's family as well. And he starts this off with a year in bed in depression. So that's how we're going to leave the Rambam for this week. And next week we'll talk about what the Rambam does when he finally is able to pick himself up and go on to the next chapter of his life. I look forward to having you join us, and I look forward to sharing it with you. Have a wonderful week.